The mirror threw back a stranger's face, and a breath caught in my throat. Red lipstick painted on my lips, too bold, too loud. I tugged the black skirt tighter, its fit daring me to step out. My steps echoed with purpose. My nails, vivid, flickered in the light. A sharp mist of perfume lingered. I was radiant, unstoppable, but my hands shook, grabbing the purse. This was me, finally me, but the world outside waited to judge. My father's voice echoed, his rage from that day I dared wear a dress. I pushed it down, heart pounding. One step toward the door, and there'd be no hiding. Was I ready to ignite the past and walk through the flames? The corridor outside my apartment felt like a runway as I made my way to the elevator, my heels tapping with resolve. The crisp fall air greeted me as I stepped outside, the azure sky stretching wide and bright, stirring memories of school days when the world felt both exhilarating and cruel. Those were the years of silent battles, of watching girls move through life with a lightness I envied, their laughter and ease a reminder of what I kept locked inside. I'd wanted to scream, to throw on a dress and walk into class as myself, but fear and doubt had held me back. The struggle had been a constant ache, a war between who I was and who I was expected to be. As I crossed the parking garage to my car, I shook off those ghosts, locking into the now. My father, Grayson, had never understood. He'd built a fortress around the idea of me as his manly man, and the one time he'd caught me dressed as myself, his rage had shattered any hope of reconciliation. We'd barely spoken since. 2 years ago, I'd left his house the moment I graduated high school, determined to carve out a life that was mine. With my savings, I'd started small, a cheap motel room to change in, then a modest apartment rented under my chosen name. Settling into that new life, I'd found work in an office, starting as a gopher, then moving up to file clerk, and now thriving as a secretary. The pay covered my needs with a little left for the occasional indulgence. Over 15 months, I'd scrimped to afford laser treatments, banishing my beard for good. Now, with minimal makeup, my face felt like my own, each glance in the mirror a quiet victory. The drive to the lawyer's office was charged with anticipation. My mother's call had come out of the blue, her voice soft but urgent, as she told me about a distant relative's passing. I'd inherited something from their estate, though I didn't know the person or why they'd thought of me. The news was strange, almost surreal, but what kept my heart racing was the knowledge that my father would be there. I'd chosen my outfit with care, not just for myself, but for this moment. The mint-colored sheath dress, found after hours of searching the mall, fit like it was made for me, its simple elegance amplified by a darker green jacket with white piping along the seams. Juliet pantyhose shimmered faintly, and pale green shoes clicked softly with each step, their color mirrored in the handbag slung over my shoulder. Small pearl earrings and a matching choker necklace added a touch of refinement. I'd stretched my budget for this ensemble, wanting to walk into that room as the woman I'd fought to become. As I navigated the city streets, a smile tugged at my lips, one I didn't bother to hide. My father's disapproval no longer held power over me. I lived on my own terms, free from his roof and his rules. My mother knew about my life, though we'd only spoken by phone, her voice warm but cautious, never quite ready to see me as I was. Today, though, I felt ready for anything. The car hummed along, carrying me toward a confrontation I didn't fear but welcomed. This was my moment to stand tall, to let the world see the woman I'd always been inside. The lawyer's office loomed ahead, and as I parked, I took a deep breath, the scent of my perfume mingling with the autumn air. Whatever awaited me, legal papers, family tension, or something else entirely, I was ready to face it as myself, unapologetically and completely. As I eased into the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of my father's broad back disappearing into the building, oblivious to my arrival. My mother lingered near the entrance, her gaze drifting until it settled on me. I emerged slowly, deliberate and steady, sliding one leg out through the open door before standing to smooth my mint-colored dress. My heart thudded, but I held my smile steady, hiding the small war behind my eyes in my eyes. With every ounce of poise I could summon, I walked toward her, footsteps light but firm on the pavement. As we met, her eyes widened. "Harper," she whispered, almost testing the name. "Avery, mother," I corrected gently, extending a hand, my lacquered nails catching the sunlight. "You're beautiful," she said, her voice thick with awe. "I am who I am," I replied, my tone firm but warm. "Shall we go in?" We stepped inside, our footsteps quiet against the plush carpet as we found the lawyer's office just a few doors down. My mother entered first, and I followed, feeling every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. I chose a chair as far from my father as possible, crossing my legs with care and resting my hands in my lap. At first, he didn't recognize me. Then, as realization dawned, his eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting into a grimace. He said nothing, though, as the lawyer began, his voice droning through the details of the will. Stocks, cash, insurance, a house complete with furnishings were all laid out in meticulous detail. My father's stare bored into me, heavy and unyielding. I met it with a serene smile, refusing to flinch. The lawyer's words finally cut to the heart of it. In essence, Harper will receive the house and one insurance policy, while the rest of the estate is split equally. I blinked, wondering how he knew my name, then realized my mother must have told him. Papers were passed around, and when it was my turn, I signed as Harper Kendall, my legal name, the pen steady in my hand. The lawyer handed my parents a check, then turned to me with a set of keys, a check, and a small map to the house. As the meeting ended, I rose to leave, my silence toward my father deliberate. I had no desire to bridge that gap, but my mother's hand caught my arm, holding me back. "Piper, can we use the room for a moment?" she asked the lawyer, who nodded and slipped out, leaving us alone. I faced my father, his expression still carved in stone. My mother's voice was firm but trembling. "Harper, this is Harper, your daughter." His response was a venomous hiss. "I don't have a daughter." I turned toward the door, my hand on the knob. "Mom," I said evenly, "I'll let you know how things go once I'm settled in the house." But her voice stopped me again, softer now, almost desperate. "Easton, it's time you both faced the truth. Harper is a beautiful young woman, and you need to see that." Then, turning to me, she added, "And you, I think it's time you explain to your father, and to me, why you've become a woman. We deserve to know what's happening." Her words hit like a slap, and I pulled my arm free, stunned by the audacity. "Do you really believe, after everything you've done, that you have any right to demand answers from me?" My voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Not hardly." My mother's eyes softened, her tone shifting to something like a plea. "Maybe we don't deserve it, but tell us anyway." I hesitated, then sank back into the chair, letting them stand there, their discomfort palpable. They sat, and I began, my voice steady but laced with years of buried pain. I reminded them of every moment I'd tried to show them who I was. Every Halloween, I'd transformed into a princess, a fairy, a storybook heroine, and later, a teenage girl, my choices screaming what words couldn't. It should have been obvious, even to someone willfully blind. But under my father's iron grip, my mother had dismissed it all, ignoring the truth I'd laid bare. "I told you," I said, my gaze flicking between them. Again and again, in every way I knew how. You chose not to see. The room felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken regrets, but I held my ground, my truth finally spoken. Unyielding and clear, I laid everything bare, my voice steady as I locked eyes with my father. "I'm supporting myself," I said, the words sharp and deliberate. "I have a good job, a life I've built. I don't care what you think anymore." The anger I'd held inside for years, carefully stored like kindling, sparked and flared. It had fueled me, given me strength, but now, as it spilled out, it felt both liberating and raw. Silence hung heavy in the room until my father's voice cut through, low and biting. "What you're doing is wrong. You're not a woman. You're just a man who looks like one. What could you possibly offer a real man? That's all you've got, isn't it?" His words were a blade, slicing through the fragile hope I'd carried into this room. I didn't bother to argue. There was no explaining myself to someone so entrenched in his own truth. I stood, and when my mother rose too, I pulled her into a brief, tight hug, then walked out without a backward glance. My attempt to bridge the chasm between us had crumbled in a handful of sentences. As I crossed the parking lot to my car, his words clung to me, an unwanted echo. He was right in one cruel way. I wasn't a woman in the way biology defined it, and no amount of longing would let me carry a child. The thought gnawed at me, a quiet ache I couldn't shake. To drown it out, I pulled the map from my purse and followed its directions, letting the road guide me to the house I'd inherited. When I arrived, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the modest facade, its windows dark and still. The key felt heavy in my hand as I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the faint must of a life left untouched. The house was fully furnished, as if frozen in time. Kitchenware gleamed faintly in the dim light. Furniture stood in silent vigil, and beds waited patiently in upstairs rooms. But it was one particular room that stopped me cold. The closet burst with elegance gowns that shimmered, tailored dresses, crisp skirts, and sleek suits, each piece a testament to a life lived boldly. Rows of shoes lined the floor, and on the vanity sat a complete makeup kit, its contents meticulously arranged. In the closet, 3 wigs rested on a shelf, their strands catching the light. My breath caught. The person who'd lived here was like me. I sank into a chair, overwhelmed, the realization washing over me that I wasn't alone in my family, that someone else had walked this path. Drawn to explore further, I wandered into an office, flicking on the light. The room was orderly, its desk commanding the space. There, propped against the computer, was an envelope, my name scrawled across it in green ink, the handwriting unmistakably feminine. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. "Harper," the letter began. "By now you've discovered that I lived my life as a woman. I kept track of you over the years, watching as you dressed up on holidays, then grew into the woman you are now. Your father knew me well and knew I'd begun living as a woman the moment I could. His anger toward you isn't about you, but about others specifically. Our father, your grandfather. Yes, I am your father's brother, your uncle, though you knew me as Aunt Logan, the one who doted on you when you were small. Griffin, not being related to you, twisted your father's world, leaving him stranded on his own island of exile. Open the top drawer of the desk and take the envelope with your name on it. Follow its instructions precisely. I promise you'll understand. Be the woman you know you are, but also a lady above all. Don't worry about children you can adopt when the right person comes along." It was signed Logan in that same green ink. I set the letter down, my mind reeling. Aunt Logan's face flickered in my memory, soft features, sparkling blue eyes, always dressed with quiet elegance. She'd had a smile that felt like a gift, often paired with a small trinket or sweet for me. When teenage years, she'd vanished from my life, leaving only those fleeting impressions. Now I knew the truth. She was my father's brother. My father had known all along what it meant to live as I did, the weight of it, the fight. Yet he'd offered me nothing, not support, not even silence. The betrayal stung deeper than his words in the lawyer's office. I opened the desk drawer, my fingers brushing against another envelope, my name written in that same green ink. I held it, unopened, feeling the weight of Logan's words and the promise of answers. Whatever lay inside, I knew it would shift the ground beneath me again. For now, I sat in the quiet of the house, surrounded by the echoes of a life so like my own, and let myself breathe. I was Harper Kendall, and no matter what my father believed, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The mention of my grandfather in Logan's letter lingered like a shadow, vague yet insistent, urging me to uncover the truth. I tore open the second envelope, and as I read, the words seemed to pulse with life, each sentence pulling me deeper into a story I hadn't known I was part of. When I finished, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mother, the only person who could fill in the gaps. She insisted on coming over, saying some things were too heavy for a call. I flung open the drapes, letting sunlight flood the dusty rooms, and propped both doors wide to chase out the stale air. While waiting, I wandered through the house, curiosity tugging me from room to room. In the kitchen, I found coffee grounds and set a pot to brew, the familiar gurgle grounding me. Then I stepped into the garage, where a light tan sedan, barely 2 years old, sat beside a gleaming collector's car, its curves pristine and tempting. I itched to take it for a spin, but the sound of my mother's car crunching gravel pulled me back outside. She greeted me with a warm hug, her eyes softer than they'd been in the lawyer's office. We settled in the living room, the scent of coffee curling through the air. In her hands was a small shoebox, its edges worn. "So, Logan told you," she said, her voice low. "Not everything," I replied, leaning forward. "Most of it was strange. She said she and Dad were brothers, and something about my grandfather that changed him. That's what I don't get, Mom. What happened?" She lifted the lid and drew out a stack of photographs, spreading them across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle. The first showed a radiant young girl, my father's arm draped around her shoulders, both of them smiling. "This is Logan and your dad," my mother said. She moved to the next, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes. "This is your grandfather." One by one, she guided me through the images, Logan and my father laughing together, Logan and my mother arm in arm, even a shot from my parents' wedding with Logan as a bridesmaid, her dress elegant and her smile bright. Many were in black and white, snapshots of a time when my parents had embraced Logan as a woman without hesitation. The ease in those photos made my father's rejection of me feel even more jarring. "What did my grandfather do to make Dad change so much?" I asked, my voice tight with the need to understand. My mother sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo. "Your grandfather was a hard man, Harper, but he never objected when Logan began dressing as a girl. Your grandmother was gone by then, so Logan naturally stepped into the role of housewife, cooking, cleaning, keeping the house in order. He made sure she had clothes, everything she needed. But when your father was about 20, he came home early from work and found your grandfather doing things to Logan he had no right to do. She was tied up, defenseless, being abused. There was a terrible fight. Your father freed her, but that image his sister, his brother, suffering like that burned into him. He took Logan and left, never speaking to his father again." I sat back, the weight of her words settling over me. My mother continued, her voice steady but heavy. "Logan healed and eventually moved away, but your father couldn't shake what he'd seen. Back then, Logan didn't have the options you do now. She lived as a single woman, dating rarely, never settling into a lasting relationship. She went to college, became an accountant, and built her own firm, thriving in her own way. Changing her name legally wasn't as simple then, which is why you didn't recognize the name on the letter. It was her birth name, not the one she lived by." She paused, her eyes distant. "When you were 9 or 10, your grandfather showed up at Logan's door, drunk and violent, trying to force himself on her again. She escaped and called your father. It was another ugly scene. The police had to drag your grandfather away." My mother set the photos down, her hands trembling slightly. "Your father's anger, Harper, it's not just about you or Logan. It's about what he couldn't protect her from, what he couldn't unsee. It twisted something in him, and he's been fighting that pain ever since." I stared at the photos, Logan's face staring back, vibrant, resilient, a woman who'd carved out her place in a world that wasn't kind to her. My father had known her truth, had loved her as his sister, yet he'd turned that same truth against me. The contradiction stung, but so did the glimpse of his pain, a wound I hadn't known he carried. The house around us felt quieter now, as if Logan's presence lingered in the walls, urging me to see the whole story, not just mine, but hers, and even my father's. I reached for my mother's hand, the shoebox between us a bridge to a past I was only beginning to understand. The weight of my mother's words pressed against me, each revelation reshaping the jagged edges of my understanding. The police were going to let him sleep it off, she'd said, her voice low. But your grandfather died that night in his cell. Since then, your father's been trapped in a kind of denial, almost pathological. When he saw you following Logan's path, all he could think of was what his father did to her. He was terrified, Harper, that he might carry that same darkness, that he could hurt you the way his father hurt Logan. To him, you're both boys who wanted to be girls, and he's been haunted by the question, how far does the apple fall from the tree? I sat frozen, the truth a tangle of shock and sorrow. Aunt Logan, a man? I'd never known, her warmth and femininity so complete in my childhood memories. My grandfather, a stranger whose shadow loomed over my father's life, was a monster I couldn't fathom. And my father, could he really fear becoming that? The man I knew, rigid and unyielding, didn't seem capable of such violence, least of all toward me. Regret flickered for how I'd lashed out at him, but his wounds were his to mend. Still, my mother believed there was a way forward. She outlined a plan, cautious but hopeful, to bring us together. I hesitated, trust in my father fragile, but her conviction swayed me. Reluctantly, I agreed. We turned to the house, armed with garbage bags, clearing out wilted flowers, spoiled food, and forgotten clutter. The work stretched late, and when I returned to my apartment, I called my boss, securing a few days off to tackle the house. That night, I slept deeply, my mind drifting to paint swatches and furniture arrangements. Morning came, and I dressed simply jeans, a tee, gym shoes, hair swept into a ponytail, a touch of lipstick for myself. I packed my coffee pot, grounds, sugar, and milk, then drove to the house, sipping from a thermos as anticipation hummed through me. Whatever lay ahead, it would leave a mark. I threw open the doors, started a fresh pot of coffee, and began sorting through Logan's meticulously kept home. The carpets were dated, the wall colors' drab changes were needed. In the bedrooms, I sifted through closets, bagging outdated clothes for charity. Logan's precision was evident, every surface polished, but time had left its mark. I was halfway through the second bedroom when a car rolled up. Peering out, I saw my mother step out alone. My father was absent, and I assumed her plan had faltered. We shared coffee, then dove back into the work, hauling out bags until a mountain of them stood outside. We paused on the porch, catching our breath. I talked to your father last night, she said, her tone careful. He'll stop by later today, Harper. You two can talk. I nodded, skeptical. We'll see, Mom. We moved to the kitchen, scrubbing dishes and wiping down cupboards. An hour later, the back door creaked open, and my father stepped inside. My pulse quickened, but I steadied myself. Lila, Dad, I said, voice even. Avery, Harper, he replied, the name sounding foreign in his mouth. My mother murmured something about another room and slipped away, leaving us alone. You're replacing the carpet? He asked, glancing around. It's an ugly color, I said. He chuckled, a rare sound. I agree. Logan never had any color sense. The small talk felt like a truce, fragile but real. I took a breath. Mom told me everything, Dad. His face tightened. So I understand. I leaned forward, testing the ground. Dad, am I so overwhelming that I'm all you think about? Is that why you... He cut me off, voice sharp. Not that. It's not that. You're a beautiful girl, Harper, but not like that. He sank into a chair, and I sat across from him, chin in my hands, waiting. It's just... After Logan, I never thought... He faltered, searching for words. 2 of you in 1 generation? I couldn't wrap my head around it. His eyes met mine, raw and unguarded, and for the first time, I saw not just his anger, but his fear of his past, of himself, of losing me to the same pain Logan endured. The kitchen held us in its quiet, the coffee pot's faint drip marking time. We weren't healed, not yet, but we were here, talking, and that was a start. The air in the kitchen felt thick, charged with the weight of my father's words and the history they carried. "In the same family?" he echoed, his voice softer now, grappling with the improbability of it all. I leaned forward, my hands still cradling my chin. "Aunt Logan was beautiful, Dad, especially when she was my age." A faint smile broke across his face, the first genuine one I'd seen from him in years. She was. Had boys trailing her everywhere, I can tell you that. But Dad, he scared most of them off. Then His voice cracked, and tears spilled down his cheeks as he looked at me, raw and unguarded. "Dad, he's gone," I said gently. "You just told me you don't see me that way, so why—" "Logan was my brother," he interrupted, his voice trembling with a mix of love and pain. "But she became my sister, and I loved her, Harper. I knew she wanted to be a girl, and I didn't care. I'd have done anything for her. But when I saw the look in her eyes after, it was like her soul had died. All the joy, the light she brought to everyone, that old man stole it from her." He choked on the words, and I sat still, sensing there was more he needed to unburden. "When we noticed you dressing up, all I could see was Logan's pain repeating itself. Your grandfather was still alive then, so we thought keeping you from it was protecting you. After he died, Logan stayed away, not wanting to sway you. I blamed myself, Harper. I thought I'd failed her, that I should have done more." I nodded, letting his words settle. "You and I, Dad?" He gave a slow, heavy nod. My voice sharpened, the hurt rising. "I'm still angry, Dad. There were so many times I needed advice, a little help, anything. But you didn't just push me away, you erased me from your life. Logan's gone, the old man's gone. Everything you feared is gone, isn't it? That leaves me. I'm your only child. If we never spoke again, what happens to you and Mom later? You'd need me then, wouldn't you? Is that why you're here?" "No." His voice was firm, almost desperate. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm here because I was wrong. I was a fool, Harper." He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine. "Easton, don't you wonder how the lawyer knew your name? Your legal name? Or how Logan knew it?" I told them, "Whatever you think of me, I always knew where you were, what you were doing. When you changed your name, the paperwork came to our house by mistake. I returned it, and they gave me your address. That's how I knew where you were. Seeing those papers, I realized how serious you were about becoming a woman. Back then, Logan didn't have the choices you do. She could love a man, but it was always different, not like a cis woman. Harper, honey, I love you. I'd never hurt you. I was the biggest fool in the world." His words hit like a wave, the sincerity in them stirring tears I fought to hold back. I wanted to show him my strength, to prove I could stand tall. Then an idea sparked. "For dinner?" I asked, my voice lighter. His face brightened, and he nodded. I called out to Mom, and we headed to the store, gathering ingredients for a meal I insisted on cooking alone. As I chopped and stirred, the kitchen filled with the warmth of simmering spices, a quiet counterpoint to the morning's tension. At dinner, we sat around the table, the clink of forks and soft conversation weaving a fragile peace. Midway through, my father slid a check across the table. "This is the money Logan left us," he said. "We don't need it, but you do. You're carrying everything she dreamed of, Harper. You're the heir to her hopes. Take it. It to become the woman we all know you are, the daughter I missed out on when you were growing up." The check lay untouched between us, its presence heavy. Part of me saw it as blood money, a gesture to ease his guilt, a salve for his pride. I didn't reach for it, not yet. Instead, I met his eyes, searching for the father I'd longed for, the one who might finally see me, not as a fear to overcome, but as his daughter, whole and true. My father's apology had taken courage, but as I sat across from him, the check still untouched between us, I felt a chasm he couldn't yet cross. He knew so little of me, of the woman I'd become. My body had begun to reflect my truth, small A-cup breasts, hips and curves softening into a gentle roundness. Body hair was a memory, erased through effort and time. Only one small, irrelevant detail remained, a vestige I dismissed as meaningless. Even my mother, who'd seen me through years of silence, didn't know the extent of my transformation. Like any woman, I kept my changes private, not for shame, but for dignity. I had no boyfriend, no one to share this with. The truth of my body was mine alone, a quiet triumph born of determination. I'd started sourcing hormones online, carefully following dosages. By the time I left home, I'd learned to conceal my budding curves, guarding my secret from a world that wasn't ready. Dad's eyes searched mine, waiting for a response. My mother broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. "Why not put the money in the bank, Harper? Or use it to fix up the house, whatever you want. There's enough to do it all." I slid the check toward me, their smiles tentative but warm. They left soon after, and I lingered to wash the dishes, the clink of plates grounding me. Back at my apartment, I lay in bed, sifting through the day's revelations. My father's guilt, his fear of becoming his own father, had shaped his rejection of me. Logan's abuse had shattered him, and in his mind, denying my identity was protection, a way to shield me from a danger he couldn't name. But their silence had left me alone, convinced my father hated the girl I was, a girl trapped in a boy's body. Logan's choice to stay away hadn't been his doing, yet he carried that weight too. By morning, resolve had settled in. I called my mother, asking them to meet me at the house. I arrived first, determined to show my father the truth of who I was. I chose tight jeans that hugged my curves, and a low neckline tee that hinted at my development. My blonde hair fell loose, framed by barrettes I'd found in Logan's jewelry box, their dark gleam a subtle nod to her. A spritz of perfume and soft red lipstick completed the look not for them, but for me, a quiet celebration of my femininity. When my father walked in, his eyes widened briefly, a flicker of surprise before he steadied himself. My mother followed, her gaze lingering as she smiled, sensing the shift in me. She asked to speak alone, and we slipped into the bedroom, closing the door as Dad rummaged in the kitchen for a drink. "You've changed so much," she said, her voice warm with wonder. "You've really developed." I nodded, unapologetic. "I started in high school, Mom. If you and Dad hadn't been so distant, I would have told you." Her eyes widened. "School? How?" I explained the ease of it, the online orders, the careful steps. Then, to make it undeniable, I lifted my tee, revealing the gentle swell of my breasts. Not to boast, but to prove I'd meant every word I'd always been a girl. She took it in stride, her expression softening with understanding, the visual proof sealing what words alone couldn't. We found Dad in the living room, shoving furniture into the center with purpose. "Makes it easier to paint," he said, glancing up. "We can move it to the kitchen when you replace the carpet." His practicality was a small olive branch, and I felt the air shift, a cautious step toward something new. I stood there, my body a testament to my truth, no longer hidden. If he had doubts about who I was, they'd have to face the reality before him, a daughter, not a fear, not a shadow of Logan's pain, but Harper, whole and unafraid. Dad and I spent hours hauling paint cans and rollers from the hardware store, the weight of our unspoken thoughts heavier than the supplies. I could feel his questions simmering, his glance flickering to me as we loaded the car. He'd seen me, really seen me yesterday, my body no longer the boy he'd once known, but undeniably female in ways he hadn't grasped. The night before, he'd claimed he accepted me, but that was before my tight jeans and low neckline had made my truth impossible to ignore. I didn't prod him to speak. If he wanted to understand, he'd have to meet me halfway. I was Harper, and that was enough. We painted the house in 2 feverish days, transforming the tired walls with crisp, clean hues. The following week, new carpeting breathed life into the floors, and I moved in, claiming Logan's house as my own. My mother was there daily, her presence a quiet bridge between us. I began to see her not just as my mother, but as a woman caught in a storm she couldn't control. She'd known about Logan's pain, endured the fallout of my grandfather's cruelty, and then faced the shock of her son wanting to be her daughter. That knowledge must have been a weight she carried silently, her love for me tangled in fear and uncertainty. Yet, in those shared moments, sorting Logan's belongings, laughing over coffee, we forged a bond I hadn't thought possible. Once, in a moment of raw trust, I'd shown her my body from the waist up, not out of pride, but to say, "This is me." That vulnerability drew us closer, and through her, I felt my father inching toward me too. His reluctance to show affection stemmed from a bone-deep fear of becoming his father, a man whose shadow still darkened our family. But my growing closeness with Mom forced us together, shared dinners, errands, quiet evenings in the house. I pushed past his walls, sitting close, kissing his cheek, holding his hand, hugging him until it felt natural. I craved his love, a need I hadn't fully recognized until it surfaced. His stubborn will, a trait I'd inherited, had driven us to retreat into our own minds, seeking safety in solitude. Logan's death had cracked that armor, leaving us both raw, and Mom's insistence that we needed each other became our lifeline. She was the spark that reignited us, her reasons clear. We were a family, fractured but not broken, and only together could we heal. The trauma of my grandfather's actions had rippled through decades, pushing us apart until I, unwittingly, became the catalyst to pull us back. My desire to be a girl uncontrollable, like a tide, had first led me to dresses, then to discovery, and finally to a rift with my father. But after the chaos, we'd found our way back. Dad stepped into his role the only way he knew how, fixing leaky faucets, tightening loose hinges, each task a quiet offering. I rewarded him with hugs and kisses, determined to be the daughter I'd always been inside. We weren't a perfect family, just an ordinary one that had faced a crisis and emerged stronger. I knew Dad's view of me had shifted when a kind-eyed man from my office asked me out. Dad cornered him, firing questions like a guard protecting a treasure. Mom gently reined him in, but I smiled, warmth spreading through me. He was my father, and I was his daughter, undeniably, at last. The house became my sanctuary, each room a canvas for my new life. I hung curtains, arranged furniture, and painted an accent wall in the living room, a bold teal, a color Logan might have loved. But the envelope from her desk, the one with my name in green ink, still sat unopened on my nightstand. I'd read her first letter, felt her presence in its words, but this second one felt different, weightier, as if it held a secret I wasn't ready to face. Weeks passed, and I busied myself with settling in, avoiding it until one quiet evening, when the house felt too still, I finally tore it open. "Harper," it began, her elegant script steady and warm. "If you're reading this, you've claimed this house as yours, and I'm glad. There's one last thing I need you to do. In the attic, behind the old wardrobe, is a locked box. The key is taped under the desk in my office. Open it, and you'll understand why I left this all to you." My pulse quickened. Logan's life had been a tapestry of courage and loss, and now she was guiding me to unravel one final thread. I climbed to the attic, the air thick with dust and memory. The wardrobe loomed in the corner, heavy and ornate. I pushed it aside, revealing a small rusted box, its lock glinting faintly. Back in the office, I found the key exactly where she'd said, its edges worn smooth. The lock clicked open, and inside I found a journal, its leather cover cracked with age, and a small velvet pouch. I opened the pouch first, gasping as a delicate gold locket spilled into my palm, engraved with a single word: truth. Inside was a tiny photo of Logan, young and radiant, her smile a mirror of my own. The journal was denser, its pages filled with her story, her joy in becoming herself, her pain at our grandfather's betrayal, her quiet pride in watching me grow. But the final entry stopped me cold. "Harper," she wrote, "I saw you, sneaking a dress from your mother's closet. I knew then you were like me, and I swore to protect you from afar. Your father's fear kept me away, but I left you this house, this locket, and my truth. There's one more thing. The account listed at the back of this journal. It's yours, enough to live as you choose, to be the woman I know you are. But there's a catch. You must face your father one last time, not as his daughter, but as my heir. Tell him I forgave him. He needs to hear it." Tears blurred the page. Logan had known me, seen me, even when I felt invisible. The account details were there, a staggering sum, but her request loomed larger. I clutched the locket, its weight grounding me. The next day, I called my parents to the house. They arrived, curious, Dad's brow furrowed as I led them to the living room. I wore the locket, its gleam catching the light, and held the journal like a shield. "Dad," I began, my voice steady, "Logan left me more than this house. She left me her story, her forgiveness. She wanted you to know she forgave you for everything. She loved you, and she knew you did your best." His face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw him cry openly, not in anger or shame, but in release. Mom's hand found his, her eyes glistening. "She saw me, Dad," I continued, "like I see you now. We're not our past. We're this us, here, together." He stood, pulling me into a hug, his arms strong and sure. "I'm sorry, Harper," he whispered, "for all of it." I hugged him back, the locket pressing against my chest, a silent vow to carry Logan's truth forward. Mom joined us, her embrace knitting us tighter, a family no longer defined by pain, but by the messy, beautiful work of healing. That night, I sat in Logan's office, the journal open before me. I added my own entry, my pen scratching softly. "Logan," I wrote, "I did it. I gave him your forgiveness, and I found mine. I'm your heir, not just in name, but in spirit. I'll live boldly, love fiercely, and make this house a home. Thank you." I closed the journal, slipped the locket around my neck, and stepped outside. The stars were bright, the air cool against my skin. I was Harper Kendall, daughter, heir, woman free at last, to be all of it.